Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I want to talk a bit about nationalism. Now, before I get into that, I just want to mention that some of the ideas I'm going to bring up are based on ideas that I previously explained in my videos about the Imperial Ethic and about my opinions regarding populism, popular sovereignty, and democracy. So, if you are confused at some point when I reference something like that, those are some videos that might be useful in explaining my viewpoints more deeply. And the reason I made those videos is so that I could make this video and I didn't have to spend a whole hour talking about other issues than the ones I wanted to talk about in this video. I've got a bit of a sore throat at the moment, so I apologize if I'm not always in best form. So, anyway, nationalism, okay, referring to the idea of having nations, or particularly nation states, if we're going to politicize the terminology. So, what is interesting about nationalism is the idea of a nation state. So, a nation, of course, always refers in some sense to nativity. Now, of course, not all forms of nationalism emphasize the idea of nativity, but the reason why nativity is evoked in the term nationalism is because nationalism and the idea of a nation state sees a cohesive group of people as the foundation for a state. So this could be cohesive either by perhaps common values or common ancestry, common genetic characteristics. There's all sorts of commonalities, even common religion could be one of those things, that these are commonalities in the people that would then lead one to say that it is good for such a group of people to get together and form a state, or to conform together in an existing state, to have a sort of national unity. So nationalism essentially posits the characteristics of a people as being foundational to that of a state. Now, of course, this is distinct from my idea of the imperial ethic, where in my idea, states are not nation states, but jurisdiction states that are established by power rather than by a popular cohesion. So my view takes a different perspective. And also, although not all forms of nationalism are populistic, uh, that is also something that my viewpoint rejects, not as being something that would be uh, a moral good, although my ethical system would reject that as a basis for morality, but rather as something that is realistic, in the sense that is something that corresponds to what is actually seen in the real world, in the sense that popular sovereignty, as is commonly understood, is only an intellectual concept and does not actually exist in the actual operations of governments that claim to exercise it. Uh, so when it concerns nationalism, then my system would not view the commonalities of a people as being something out of which to form a state, but rather the structures of rulership of the people being the ones that form the state. In other words, the state is formed through a sort of conquest. Now, this isn't not to say that this should always be an aggressive conquest or should always be involuntary, but essentially, I see patriation, or the becoming a member of a country, as as being a form of of subjugation to the imperium of the rulership of that country, and therefore it is a form of imperialism. Now, I use the term imperialism in a neutral sense because I view imperialism similar to democracy as being a tool that can be that can have good ways of being used and bad ways of being used, and that is all very situational. So the way I view patriation from an imperial perspective is that patriation occurs through three different means. There's native imperialism, which means an individual is born in the jurisdiction of the state and therefore is conquered by virtue of his birth in that state. Uh, and that means that obviously someone who is born in the country it falls under the jurisdiction of that country, at least while that person is within that country. And that form of native imperialism is something that I believe is very real in every state, or at least in every state that actually establish its own jurisdiction and is not falling apart into an anarchy or something. So, I believe that this is something that every state practices, a native imperialism, whether it be a state that is based on a single nation or a multinational state or a city state or anything. These are all all of these practice native imperialism. And I don't view that as a bad thing. In fact, I view that as a good thing because otherwise you would have to uh, wait on these until these people are grown up, and then you have to ask them if they want to be part of your state, even though they're living in the jurisdiction, and that's too voluntarist. And I don't think that a state can survive under such a system for very long. So yes, so there's a native imperialism. And of course, this is involuntary because obviously an infant cannot answer when asked whether an infant would like to fall under the jurisdiction of a state. And I don't view this as a bad thing again. So then there's also migrant imperialism, where individuals who enter into the territory of a state naturally are conquered and fall under the jurisdiction of that state. Now, I want to be very clear here. This is not the same thing as citizenship. Citizenship and being a subject to a state are two different things. Especially if you were to look at the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, there's a very clear distinction between being a subject of the Romans and being a citizen. Citizenship is something that's very specific and has certain political elements to it that makes it distinct from being a subject of a state. So this would include not only individuals who move to that state, but also individuals who are simply visiting, because by virtue of traveling within the jurisdiction of that state, those individuals must be subject to that jurisdiction. Now, of course, this is not counting more complex issues of individuals being held accountable for their actions abroad by their home countries, and questions of diplomatic immunity, both of which would have to also be acknowledged by the state within whose jurisdiction these individuals are residing. So it is still within the jurisdiction or within the imperium of that state. And the final one is the so we've had the native imperialism, the migrant imperialism, and finally there is the expansion imperialism, where a state expands its borders, and by virtue of expanding its jurisdiction, individuals living within the expanded jurisdiction therefore become subjects of the state. And that's another element in that. And I think that these three rules apply to all states. All states operate these three different kinds of imperialism. If they did not, then they would be giving away severe disadvantages by not operating in this manner. So, what I'm saying essentially is that in the real world, uh, this the subjectness to a state is largely determined upon the jurisdiction of that state rather than upon the cohesion of the population of that state. Now, of course, that's not counting rebellions and things like those, but just in general speaking to that. So, what about nationalism? Well, let me be very clear here. I'm not a nationalist. I'm also not a globalist. I'm not a a city statist. Okay, I'm not in favor of any size of government, or to be more exact, any sphere of government activity in particular. In fact, my system is designed so that it could function in a Neolithic collective of villages in a mountain valley somewhere, or up to the scale of an intergalactic state. So I've designed my system so that it can function in both those situations and every situation in between. So when it concerns whether or not globalism is within the purview of my system, I do not view globalism as a virtue, and therefore I view global unity as something that is not a priority for a state. Um, Now, of course, I also view conquest of territory as something that under certain situations is allowable. And if such a state were to conquer the whole world, then that wouldn't be a problem for me. But if it only operated in a very small area, that also isn't a problem for me either. So when it concerns the scale of control, that is not really something that is being addressed. Now, what about civic nationalism? Well, again, in the Imperial Ethic, the idea of how much the people want to be united and want to have common values is something that is somewhat irrelevant, because regardless of what the people want, the state exists and the state exerts its control. Now, this is not to say that the people don't have a say in that, because of course there does exist a form of cellular democracy. So even up to the very highest levels, there's always a degree of accountability. Now, when it then concerns ethno-nationalism, the concerns for the ethno-nationalists could be one of a few different ones. There could be a concern for national unity, that they want to unite their ethnicity into one nation, which, from a standpoint of operating a state, is not something that you would want as a subgroup within your state. You wouldn't want that happening, because from my perspective, it would complicate the flexibility of the bureaucratic hierarchy, which I designed to be very flexible. Having fixed units within that would sort of throw a wrench in the system. So that's not something that I'm in favor of. Now, another concept is the idea of ethnic autonomy. And this is something that I actually don't have a problem with, because in my system, individuals can gather together in a community and decide their own socioeconomic policies. So if they want to have a racially exclusive community, that's something that they're entirely free to have. If they want to have a community that has particular cultural values, that's something they're entirely free to have. And they're free to have these communities in any number that they want. And they are free for the communities to associate in order to together have commonalities on policies, uh, and they can do that as much as they want. Then that's not a problem under my system. Now it's only when they want to then alter the hierarchy so that they are treated in a preferential way, that's something that I would not allow. And I also, on this position of individual rights, would also allow individuals who feel oppressed because of their ethnicity or because of any other reason to leave communities as such and to join other communities that are more tolerant of them, or to form those communities together with other like-minded individuals. So my system is a system that allows individuals to either live together in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, or to live separately in monocultural, mono-ethnic societies. And both of those are fine, and there's no problem there. And they can uh, and again, something I haven't really mentioned before in at least this series of videos is that in under my system, in order for someone to move into a community, they would have to get the permission of that community. So if they want to keep certain individuals out, they can do that. Now let me just be very clear that don't I personally don't have any desire for an ethnically pure society personally. That's not something I'm looking for. That's not one of my priorities. So this is not probably not the exact community that I would live in, but I don't have a problem with those communities existing in my system because it also allows for experimentation. Because if it is indeed true, as some of these individuals say, that those communities will prosper more and will be more successful, then if those communities are established, then they will prosper and they will increase in their commonality as they have prospered and as their system has been demonstrated to be a beneficial system. Now, if they don't prosper and they don't do well, then they will become rare. I don't think they would ever be fully extinguished, but they would simply, the racially exclusive communities would just become more rare because they're not as successful. And I think that's fine because it shows which systems work, which systems don't work, and just which systems are good in general and which systems are not good in general. So, from that perspective, I think that by giving autonomy, it sort of eliminates the at least the defensive need that some individuals have for establishing ethnostates, because under my system, that would not be necessary because they would simply be able to organize themselves into communities defensively if they should choose to do so. And I think that's a fair thing, even though that's not something that I personally would be involved in. It's something that I allow them to do because I think that it's good to be able to experiment in that way and to be able to build the society that you want to live in and build the society that you want to establish for future generations. And if the future generations judge what you have done to be good, then they will maintain it. If they judge it to have been a bad idea, then they will replace it with something that they consider to be a better idea. But there you go. So therefore, my system renders the national unification as something that is disapproved of, and it considers the idea of national unity of the people to be irrelevant for the political system anyway, in a structural sense. And it also considers the idea of autonomy for various groups, not necessarily ethnic groups, but even groups that have a common economic persuasion or common religious persuasion. It allows this autonomy, rendering those types of nationalism that seek this autonomy and separation as being essentially redundant or accomplished through my system. So I think that that's how my system interacts with nationalism, generally speaking. So tell me what you think. Is there a particular element of nationalism that you would like me to address in a future video, something that I perhaps have not addressed? Um, and we'll see what comes out. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Please leave a comment in the comment section below. Like if you like the video, or if you can share the video if you think that it might be useful to others. And I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.